Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and this evening we have with us author Janice L. Newman to celebrate the release of her latest book, At First Contact, which is 3 short romance novellas spanning many different genres. Janice L. Newman has come a long way from her college days as a music and Japanese major. A talented writer, she has contributed to Rediscovery, Science Fiction by Women, and is currently working on more thrilling science fiction and fantasy romances. Janice's experience as a corporate controller make her invaluable as the backbone for Journey Press and 3-time Hugo finalist Galactic Journey. She resides in San Diego with her writer husband, artist, writer, and musician daughter, a gopher-eating cat, and a lump of a snake. Without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Janice to read an excerpt from one of the novellas in this fine collection, At First Contact.
All right. What do you think it'll be like? Jay asked one day. The planet? No, the next pop boy band group. I grinned. His sarcasm was getting better. How should I know? I got the same briefing you had. He looked at me steadily. I must admit, I've been a little curious. About the planet? About you. I gave him a quizzical look. Aren't you worried that the surface will be... He paused and glanced at me. Slimy? I interjected. Yes, you don't seem concerned about going out onto it despite your situation. Diplomacy was one thing I hadn't had to teach Jay. I shrugged. I know it seems weird, but the truth is, as long as I have a barrier between me and it, I'll be fine. The spacesuits are designed to be perfect, and the decontamination procedures are second to none. If I could walk around back home wearing a suit like that all the time, I'd be able to live a relatively normal life. I see, he said thoughtfully. So merely seeing something slimy doesn't affect you? No, I can watch videos of slime molds or whatever all day long. It's when I have to touch something, a shudder rippled through me, that it bothers me, or smell, or taste something. Slime molds aren't particularly dangerous, he said with a small smile. I rolled my eyes. You know very well that it's not a matter of danger. It's not even a matter of germs, exactly. It's not logical. It's just... I shifted my shoulders uncomfortably. Organic things. Some people are upset by teeth or bones, but they never bothered me. But the squishy parts of things, ugh. And skin, hair, anything that can flake off in bits. I put my hand over my mouth, swallowing hard. I'm sorry, we can talk about something else, said Jay quickly. I'll be all right, just give me a second. He took a deep breath. Any other questions? I preferred to satisfy his curiosity now rather than have to revisit the subject later. Jay looked down at the console, his tone casual. How long has it affected you? Pretty much my whole life. One of my earliest memories is when I was 4 and washing up at the sink in my preschool before snack time. Most of the kids got in trouble for not washing long enough, but my teachers got mad because I took too long. I remember feeling like my hands weren't clean enough, like I had to keep doing it. What might have been pity flickered across Jay's expression, and I felt my shoulders tighten. I've mostly been able to work past that kind of thing, but yeah. Elementary school was kind of hellish. The other kids discovered that they could make me flinch pretty easily just by, smearing mud on my arm. One time I threw up when a kid flicked his booger at me. I hope he got in trouble, said Jay quietly. I shrugged. I don't remember, to tell you the truth. I went home sick. It doesn't matter now. I stood up and stretched. Once I got to middle school, my parents found a program where I could take classes remotely through the net, and things got much better after that. And, there was one person I worked with, a remote counselor, who told me that my weirdness might be an asset someday. I was skeptical, but when I was chosen for the mission, I realized she'd been right. That was awfully satisfying. I know what you mean. I blinked. You do? My activation didn't go entirely according to plan. The experience was horrible at the time, but it gave me an edge later. Intrigued, I settled back down into my chair. I never heard anything about this. What happened? I mean, if you don't mind talking about it. He shook his head and gave me his small smile again. I don't mind. It's a little difficult to explain, though. He looked out at the hyperspace stars, his eyes darting from one tiny V to the next. We don't have a childhood, per se. Our brains are built directly into adult bodies and brought online in stages. They're too complex to simply copy knowledge into them the way you would move files from computer to computer. We have to learn. However, we can learn extremely quickly, so much so that it seems from the outside as simple as copying files over. He folded his hands together in his lap. His back was straight, as always. I didn't think he could slouch, even if he wanted to. When first activated, the protocol is to send multiple streams of information into an android's brain, teaching them. Once online, we must have access to a great deal of information, not only scientific or mathematical, but also about how humans interact, social and vocal cues, everything a human has between 18 and 20 years to learn before they are expected to be an adult. This learning is done before the android is brought fully conscious. It's, he frowned slightly, subconscious, I suppose. But I wouldn't know. My consciousness and emotional subroutines came online early. I leaned forward a little, feeling my eyes go wide. How did that happen? Perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps there was some sort of deliberate sabotage. I think it was simply a glitch. Whatever it was, it meant that I became awake and aware just before they started the learning process. He closed his eyes. I was like a baby, helpless and without context for the sounds around me. That state only lasted a few seconds, though, before the flood began. That sounds ominous. He shrugged. I suppose it depends on your point of view. Standard practice is to stimulate multiple parts of the brain at once, generally 4 at a time, with different types of knowledge. How could that even work? I said, bewildered. A human couldn't do it, but an android's brain can. The problem was that I had to do it consciously. It was, he shook his head, overwhelming. A flood of data was coming in, all of which I had to keep track of and try to absorb. I quickly learned who and what I was, and I recognized the importance of keeping up with the information coming in, but it was so hard. There was a quiet, almost broken quality to his voice. He sounded like a person reliving a nightmare. Someone must have realized something was wrong, I said, my own voice going gruff with anger. They did eventually. My brain wasn't fully hooked up to my body yet, since I wasn't supposed to be conscious. I couldn't access my motor or vocal functions or make any kind of voluntary movement at all. But you could make involuntary movements. His expression transformed, becoming pleased. I'm so glad to be working with you, he said, and I felt sudden heat prickling across my face. Yes, as I said, my emotional subroutines were engaged along with my consciousness. After 4 days of enduring the input and trying to keep up with it, the closest analog is probably exhausted. I couldn't stop the streams from coming in, and I couldn't ignore them. All I could do was try to manage them. I knew they were important, and I was terrified of missing anything. So I just kept going, wondering how long it would continue. And eventually the techs noticed, well, he looked away. They noticed tears on my face. You can cry? We are made in your image, he said. His gaze drifted back to the hyperspace stars, and he sounded distant. We can laugh and cry and even dream. He went quiet. I didn't want to break his reverie, but I was dying to hear the rest of the story. Eventually, I said, what happened when the techs noticed? They stopped the input streams at once. The relief. He shook his head. I was a part of a series of 10 designed for this mission. They investigated the issue, but it hadn't affected any of the other androids, just myself. Restless, I got up and went to the wall station where the coffee pouches were stored. After heating one and taking a sip, I remembered the beginning of our conversation. You said it gave you an edge? Oh, he said, yes. They couldn't hook the streams back up, so they arranged for me to learn on my own and allowed me to control the pace. I still learned far more quickly than a human, but I lagged behind the others. I managed to mostly catch up by the time the rest were brought fully online, but there were still gaps in my programming. I was never very good with profanity, for example. I never learned to dance. He glanced over at me, his eyes soft, before looking away. I was convinced that I wouldn't be chosen for the mission. He touched the top of the console lightly. However, when the time for testing came, I outstripped the others in certain areas. Which areas? Multitasking, for one, he said. He sounded almost smug, and I didn't blame him. I could handle simultaneous inputs and unstable situations with multiple elements far better than any of the others. I also tested much higher for empathy. I nodded. Because you suffered. He looked at me curiously. Do you think suffering is a prerequisite for developing empathy? Not a prerequisite, I said. But when one understands in a visceral... I stopped and rephrased. That is, in a personal way. I think it does make it easier to relate to the suffering of others. Don't you? He inclined his head. It apparently made a difference in my case, at least. They determined that my higher capacity in those areas more than outweighed my lack in others. And so I was chosen, just as you were. In the end, I wasn't broken at all. He met my eyes. I had to swallow hard. Thank you for telling me. Of course, we're crewmates. Yeah, I said, we are. That's the end of the excerpt.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Janice. So we're going to move into the interview portion of the event. If anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we can get to those. So Janice, as a writer, you move very fluidly from one genre to another. When and why do you reach for one versus another? And what do you find to be the strengths of each individual genre?
Thank you for the compliment. I think it really depends on why I would reach for one for the other, or the other would depend more on what kind of story I was trying to tell. In the first one, and At First Contact, I wanted an android character, and an android character kind of necessitates a science fiction setting. And in the second one, I had come up with the idea of a boy talking to a ghost, and that kind of necessitated a paranormal setting. And in the third one, I had this idea for this world where magic could happen in very specific, narrow, controlled circumstances. And so that led naturally to a modern fantasy setting. As to the strengths and weaknesses, I think science fiction is a little more rigid than the other two because you're trying to mimic reality to some degree. You are allowed certain hand waves, warp drives, for example, faster than light. You can say, okay, this exists in this world and it has a scientific basis, but I'm not going to explain it to you. But if you establish, for example, that they land on a watery world, you need to keep that consistent. You have to have the world behave in a way that is logical within what we understand to be the laws of physics and the way things work. With paranormal, I actually haven't written that before I wrote Ghosted. And that was a very interesting and fun one because you don't really need to explain why somebody is a ghost or something like that, why paranormal things exist. They just sort of do. So there's a little bit less, and in this case, because of the narrowness of the story I told, I didn't really have to explain how it affected the world. With a touch of magic, I think magic is a lot of fun to write. But in some ways, science fiction is rigid, but magic can be trickier in some ways because you have to think about how magic affects the world. In the case of A Touch of Magic, because it was our world with just some slight differences based on the magic, I had to think how that was possible and how narrowly the world must be affected, because otherwise the butterfly effect would cause a completely different kind of universe. You add magic in, and you don't, unless you put it in very narrow controlled circumstances, you don't get our world, you get something else. And so you have to think about how magic interacts with the real world. And unless you have something where it's like cut off completely, like Hogwarts or something, where it's separated from our world, you can't have our world in the same way. So that was a fun and interesting thing. And that's both a strength and weakness, that you get more freedom, but in some ways you get less, especially if you're trying to mix it into a modern fantasy, real world setting. If you've got a fantasy world, you can have a little more flexibility there. But then in that case, you have a whole world you have to design, and that has to play by its own rules too. So that has its own challenges.
I loved the connection between magic and art, how art can be the precursor for why magic exists. I liked that touch in A Touch of Magic.
Thank you.
All the stories in this collection, the collection is 3 novellas for those that haven't read it yet. All the stories in this collection are essentially romance stories. And you sort of answered this already, but you thread this romance through science fiction, fantasy, and paranormal fiction. And I'm curious, what made you decide to take this approach specifically in blending of these genres with the romance genre?
Well, I like to write romance, and I like to read genre fiction. There's a lot of romance set in the real world. There's a lot of stories. There is less romance that is set in genre worlds, but I really enjoy genre fiction, and so it was kind of natural to me to do both, because romance is sort of where I live in terms of the things I like to write the most. But I didn't see why I couldn't have both. Like, why couldn't I do a science fiction story basis with a romantic part, a romantic focus? And I think I think we'll probably be seeing more of that to some degree. You can have, for example, a fantasy story that has a romance in it. But I like making romance a big focus of my story so that they are inarguably romances, with the traditional happy ending. But I like having the breadth, the flexibility to be able to put it in any kind of world I want, because why not? Isn't that more fun?
And then out of personal curiosity, because I'm not particularly well versed in romance, aside from happy endings, what are some of the key pillars of the romance genre?
Well, the one unbreakable rule for romance is that you either have what they call an HEA, happily ever after, or an HFN, happy for now. Other than that, I think you have a certain amount of flexibility. And I don't necessarily want to call myself an expert on the genre. I just know that those are pretty much requirements. If you don't have a happy ending, you're not really allowed to call it romance. And if you try to, people will get mad at you because that's what people want. They want a simple story of people falling in love, and either there's a reassurance that they're going to live happily ever after, or at least they're happy for now. And even if things look like they may not last forever, at least you get a feeling of this is good for now. They're in a good place. I think it just depends. Besides that, you could have really any kind of romance or genre. There's just an awful lot that are sort of the traditional, woman meets handsome guy and they fall in love, and it's the real world, and there's nothing particularly speculative or unusual about it. And there's absolutely, I want to say, nothing wrong with that story or with that genre. And there's also there are more and more genre romances coming out, particularly from small publishers and self-publishers. But it's kind of a new thing. It's not something that we've seen very much until self-publishing and print on demand became more common and more widely available. Up to then, you saw a very kind of specific and sometimes formulaic type of romance that was just mostly what you saw out there.
Thank you for indulging me about that. All the romances I've read have been science fiction as well. So, and then this isn't applicable to all of the stories in the collection, but I'm really curious what challenges you faced while writing interspecies relationship. I don't know that androids would be called a different species, but if it's sentient, then it is, right?
I think so. Writing Jay was a lot of fun. He was actually my favorite part to write in At First Contact. And you get to hear a little bit about his background, which happens pretty early in the story, so that's not a huge spoiler or anything. I don't know that it was a huge challenge because I got to have everything I wanted with Jay. I got to have an android, and again, it's the hand wave, right? I got to say, okay, this android has emotions just like a human. He came to be in a different way, but we can appreciate him as readers as essentially a human. The challenging parts came more thinking about how he would be structured physically, because that becomes critical to the story later. What features he would have and not have, and how his what parts of his body would be necessary and wouldn't. Whether does an android need to have skin and hair, or are these just put on for the comfort of the human's companions, for example. So the most challenging thing was just, and of course, thinking about what kind of trauma, what trauma could an android suffer, and that sequence of his activation was just kind of came to me one day, and I really enjoyed putting that together and figuring that out. In some ways, it was more of a challenge to figure out how he was different than how he is the same, because I started off with the premise that he was a being that the main character could fall in love with. And as such, there had to be human qualities to him, or at least lovable qualities to him. And then from there, sort of work backwards to how he was different from us as an android, what did set him apart. And so I think that was the challenging part, perhaps.
Do you think you'll be writing more romances, interspecies, that are perhaps not anthropomorphic?
I don't know. I really don't know what I'll be doing next for that. It just depends on whatever inspires me at that moment. I was particularly inspired to go with androids at that point. But anything's possible in the future. Perhaps I will go with a more alien romance someday. That's something, maybe an idea to write down.
And in your stories, the characters, they often have to overcome anxieties in order to connect with each other. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and why you've chosen this device in these stories?
I think it's just something I really like, to have characters who feel lonely or inadequate, and then have another character who loves them, not despite whatever issues they have, and not because of whatever issues they have, but including those issues. All of the writers, or most of the characters in the volume have some kind of thing that alienates them from society in one way or another, some kind of mental or physical issue. Like you heard the main character has a germophobia and kind of some OCD qualities to that. And you heard Jay had his own issues where he felt inadequate because of his issues with his activation. Having these types of characters who have these difficulties, and then having other characters love them and give them acceptance and comfort and tell them that they are worthy of love and deserving of love. To me, that speaks to something really deep in me. And so it's a theme I tend to return to again and again. There's also a lonely quality to many of the characters. Believe it or not, at First Contact, the first story was written before the pandemic. So even though it's very visceral in many ways now, it entirely was conceived and written before the pandemic even started. But the other two stories were written during the pandemic. So these themes of loneliness and isolation were very much what I was experiencing at the time, because my family and I were very, very strict about isolating ourselves. And that was very hard for us. We're extroverts, we're natural, we like naturally gregarious people, we like people. And so being so isolated was rough. And that comes through, I think, to a degree in the loneliness and the isolation of the characters in the story. And so that addressing that also was something that gave me a lot of pleasure and a chance to escape a little bit when I was writing them.
We've got a great question from the audience here. This one is from Robin. Hey, Robin. Do you have a preference for writing men, women, or women-men relationships, and why? And she's also noticed that the narrator in First Contact is never associated with a certain pronoun or gender. Was this intentional, or did you purposely want them to be gender neutral to the reader?
I'll answer the second question first. That is correct. At First Contact, the main character is never, their gender is never specified, and that is entirely intentional. I wanted to leave it up to the reader how they read them, and I tried not to code them too strongly one way or the other. When I initially conceived the story, there was some idea in the back of my mind that they might be female, but I've given the story to other people to read who read the main character as male. So I hope that I've succeeded in making them not coding them too strongly in one direction or another. Partly when I realized that I hadn't really specified too much early in the story, when I was very first putting the words down for it, I realized it didn't really matter what their gender was, because their character and their role in the story, it wasn't relevant to the story. And so it was kind of a personal challenge to myself. Could I write this story without referring to them by one pronoun or another, which is tricky, although it was a lot easier because it was first person. And can I do it without coding them too strongly as traditionally masculine or feminine? So that was fun. As to my preference, I have more experience writing male-male relationships. I've written fan fiction in the past, and I've written a lot of those male-male stories. Partly that because those were the characters who appealed to me at the time, and partly because that's what a lot of fans are looking for. But the very first stories I ever wrote, the first fan fiction stories I ever wrote, actually were female-female. And I want to write more female-female stories, and I'm actually working on one right now. So I think it's a little easier just because I've done more male-male stories, and I think also because as a woman, you would think it would be easier to write female-female stories because of personal experience, but it's a little more intimate to write female-female stories, and sometimes it's easier to put it at a remove because you're clearly writing about two other people who aren't you, at least for me, because I'm a cisgender woman. I don't really like writing male-female relationships. There's two reasons why. One is because it's been done a lot. there's a lot of male-female romance out there. And the other is that you can play with power dynamics when you have a male-male or a female-female relationship that you can't always do in when you have two different genders. If you have a female character cry in front of a male character, that has a kind of a specific, I'm not even sure if I could put it into words, but it has a different vibe. It has, if you have a male character being more aggressive with a female character than with another male character, it has a different feel to it. And sometimes it's easier to just take a step back and not get into that by making both characters the same gender.
Do you think we'll ever be able to have stories where this societal patriarchal influence isn't adding all this baggage to our characters?
Well, I hope so. And I mean, as I said, in At First Contact, you actually could read the main character as female if you want to, or if that's how you read them. I mean, simply knowing that the person who wrote the book is a woman may predispose you to reading them one way or another. But so a lot depends on the story. It depends on how it's told. But I still personally think, as things stand right now, maybe it's cheating a little, but I like to kind of not get into it. Maybe someday it'll be easier to do that without worrying how it comes across.
I hope so. I've noticed that in your stories, a lot of your gay characters, they come off to me, at least, as a bit timid and perhaps a little bit unsure of their sexuality. And I wondered, is this to show younger readers that it's okay to go through these more nervous stages of our sexuality? Or do you have other reasons for portraying the characters in this way?
Well, that's not something I intentionally put in. If anything, I kind of wanted their sexuality not to be a point of anxiety for them, or not explicitly so. There's also a lot, I mean, pretty much the story for queer teens in our culture is the story of coming out, right? That's the theme we see over and over and over again, is coming out and dealing with being gay in our society. And that's certainly the mainstream story we've seen. And that's not the story I want to tell, not because I think it's a bad story, but because it's not the story that speaks to me. So I tried to make these characters old enough and established enough and comfortable enough with who they were, that the queerness of it wasn't really an issue. Maybe a little bit here and there, but that it's not the focus of the stories. It's not where the drama comes from, if that makes sense. The focus is not, oh my gosh, I like a boy. It's like, oh my gosh, I have this friend who is a ghost and I can't find him anymore. Or I have this crewmate who's an android and maybe I'm falling in love with him. Or I'm, an adult and a gay person in this society, but I have other anxieties about what I view as inadequacies about myself. But one of them is not that I'm gay. It's that I'm short or I have other chronic issues. And these these influence how I think of and view myself. But I actually wanted to avoid queerness as being a source of drama and a source of angst. So it's interesting that you say that they read as timid, and I will have to consider that and consider why they come across that way, and maybe try to avoid that in future stories.
Perhaps that's more related to the general anxieties of the characters that we spoke about earlier. You also write under a nom de plume. What makes you decide to write under one name versus another? And do you find that in your work you write with a different voice depending on which name that you're using? And while Janice is answering that question, I'm actually going to throw a link to one of her other books that's written under a pen name while she answers.
So I have two main names that I write under, and it's not a huge secret, which is why Jean-Paul is sharing with you the other one. My first book, The Eighth Key, was published under the name Laura Weir. And this book, At First Contact, was published under my maiden name, Janice L. Newman. So why the two names? Why not just publish everything under one name? The Eighth Key has sex in it, and this volume of stories does not. And it was simply made sense to me at the time, especially when I was publishing my very first book that had explicit sex scenes in it, explicit gay sex scenes in it. I was very uncomfortable sharing that with my family at the time. I've since relaxed about that quite a bit, but even so, it's not, I didn't want to tell my mom, hey, I just published my first book, here it is. And it's got explicit sex in it. I was just really uncomfortable with that. And so I decided I would basically have two brands. I would have my Laura Weir brand, which is, it's got explicit sex. The sex is generally part of the story, woven into the story. I think in some ways, in terms of voice, I think it's maybe a little more lush. And then I've got the Janice L. Newman. I chose to use a different name from my real name, Janice Marcus, partly because my husband also publishes under his name, Gideon Marcus. And I feel like there's, it gets uncomfortable to be known as the wife of a person publishing something, or the spouse of a person publishing something. I wanted to differentiate the two of us very clearly, so that if he ever edited my books or other things, that it wouldn't be immediately obvious on a first order read that we were related. And so I chose, and plus just for the comfort of not immediately making it clear, you know, giving my real name, putting it out there. It's not difficult to find out who I am if anybody's really looking, but it requires at least a little bit more of an internet search than just putting in my real name. So I felt like that made me a little more comfortable as well.
So when you're writing, how do you know where romance ends and erotica begins?
You know, I researched that a bit myself, because I wanted to know, is this erotic romance? Is this a romantic erotica? You know, what is it? I read a definition that if you can cut the sex scenes out without losing the plot, then it's romance, not erotica. If the sex is absolutely critical to the story, then it's erotica. But I would still call something like The Eighth Key, I would call that erotic romance, not romantic erotica, because it's not, the sex is not the focus of the entire story. The sex, I won't say it's incidental, it's not, it's part of the story, it's part of the plot, and it's important to the plot, but it's not the focus of the plot. It's just part of it. And honestly, there's sex scenes in regular fantasy novels. There's sex scenes in regular science fiction novels, regular adventure novels. So having a sex scene in and of itself doesn't necessarily make a story romance or erotica. Even having several sex scenes doesn't necessarily make it that. But because it's a queer story, that puts it another, gives it another level of, and I'm not even sure of the word I want, but it makes it a little more forbidden, and it makes it a little bit more something that people have to set aside. And so people can't just say, oh yeah, this is a fantasy novel. It's got to be, erotic romance fantasy novel, a queer fantasy novel, so that people know what they're getting. And I mean, partly that's just making sure people know what they get, which is important. But yeah, the knowing where one ends and one begins is tricky, and not everybody agrees on where that line is, right? But for me, I would call what I write romance first and foremost. And sometimes it has sex in it, and sometimes it doesn't.
That seems like a fair and accurate description to me. A lot of the erotica books I've read, if you removed the sex, the plot would fall apart. So that's
Exactly.
I'll go with that with your definition there. You're also the editor at Galactic Journey, which I'll drop a link in the chat if the audience doesn't know about. Can you tell us about your work there and how it has affected your writing of fiction?
Well, Galactic Journey is a fun project. My husband and my daughter and I live in the past, day by day, 55 years ago. So right now it's what, December 14th, 1966. What does that mean? I had somebody ask me once, well, do you make your coffee with an old-fashioned coffee maker? And I'm like, no, we have an espresso machine. But we try to consume the media of the time. We try to understand the context of the time. And we have a whole group of people taking the journey with us now, which is a lot of fun and really exciting. So it started out as a project to read the science fiction novels chronologically of the time. It was just something my husband was doing and sharing it. And it grew to include scientific space shots and political articles and articles about art and comics and fashion and all kinds of things day by day, interesting moments of the time. And it gave me this view of the past, which I had never gotten in school. It gave me an understanding of the context in ways that I had never really grasped when I was growing up and when I was learning, the list of dates that you have to memorize in history class. And that was, it's been really exciting and a joy to participate in that, and also often eye-opening. There's nothing like thinking about the fact that we live in a time when gay marriage is now legal in this country, when 55 years ago you could still go to jail for being gay. And that fact, the putting those two facts next to each other is just one example of ways that we have moved forward tremendously, even if things are still bad in many ways, and even if we have a long way to go. We have definitely moved forward in significant ways. How it affects my writing, I don't know that it does affect my writing directly, because I read a lot of the stories that we have on the journey, and I enjoy them. And so to some degree, they affect me as reading any science fiction story affects you, as it makes the world that you are, the media that you consume affects you and broadens your view of what is possible as a writer. But in terms of specifics, it's difficult to say. Just in a more general sense of consuming fiction, learning about the world around you, all of those things affect you as a writer and as a person.
Despite reading so much material from 55 years ago, your fiction feels very modern. Um, I hate to go into the influences question, but what sort of thing are you into that's not related to the journey that perhaps is more related to what you like to write?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly, I have other influences that are outside the journey. The uh, I'll admit, when I wrote At First Contact, I was playing Detroit Become Human, which is a game about being an android in the near future, and it's about androids fighting for freedom and recognition as essentially humans. So I had androids on the brain when I came up with the story. That was why I started with uh, androids and wanted an android in my story. He's not a character from Detroit Become Human. It's not fan fiction, but I was thinking about androids a lot because I'd been playing this game, which is a great game, and really enjoying the ideas of androids and all these things. Lately, I've been watching a lot of Chinese dramas, which has been really interesting. There's some really interesting genre shows, and they're different from what I'm used to in American shows, American dramas. They tend to be long but complete. They tell a whole story from beginning, middle, and end. They're like a novel broken up into pieces, rather than a lot of our shows keep going. If they're popular, they just keep drawing it out, keep drawing it out. And that's not the case. And of course, it's not always the case, but it's very much not the case with these shows, which are generally based on novels, genre novels usually, and tell that story and then they are done. And some of them do have, interestingly for China, some of them do have themes of male-male romance. And some of them have they tap into fantasy themes and tropes which are not Western. And for me, that's really refreshing and different, even if they might be done to death in China. But for me, that's something new because I grew up in a very sort of, Western European fantasy background. And so some of the ideas and themes are definitely influencing the next things that I'm writing.
I have noticed in Asian cinema, I've seen more Korean cinema, but that oftentimes the storytelling will try and have a little bit of everything in it, whether it's romance, comedy, drama, and I think that's a really wonderful approach. And I applaud you for that because non-Western traditions of beauty can be so different. For instance, I love Chinese opera, and for the Western listener, it can be quite difficult to get over the hump of seeing the beauty there. So will this affect your writing of fantasy, and are we going to see more perhaps other non-Western type of backgrounds in the fantasy?
Well, actually, the next book I'm working on, and I know that's probably your next question, isn't under the name Janice L. Newman. It's under Laura Weir. And it's a female-female romance. And it's actually a very Western story. It's a retelling of Snow White. And that comes from a much older influence on me than my current influences. When I was a kid, I used to collect fairy tales, especially more obscure fairy tales, books of fairy tales, and retellings of fairy tales. When I was a teenager, I encountered Tanith Lee's Red as Blood, and it just hit me like a hammer. This idea that you could take this existing story and transform it into something completely different. Red as Blood takes the idea of Snow White and turns it into a vampire story, and it's a brilliantly done. Still one of my favorite retellings. So for this story, I tapped into my fairy tale roots. But some of the way that the relationship between the main characters works is influenced by things I have seen in C-dramas. It won't necessarily be obvious to people who aren't me to know how that influence came about. And it's attenuated through my own personal ideas of what of the way things work and things. But nevertheless, just certain themes in the romance itself are affected by themes that I've been seeing off and on in the novels the translated novels I've been reading and the dramas I've been watching. I'd like to incorporate more Chinese magic and things into it, but it's not something I know or understand well enough to do well yet. So maybe someday I will do more with that.
So you did kind of answer my next question, what you're currently working on, but I wonder what else is coming up next for you. What can readers perhaps expect from upcoming novels and novellas? And also, will there be more fanfic? I didn't really know that you also wrote fanfic, and now I'm super curious about this.
Well, I'm not going to give you my username, my AO3 name here, but if you want to contact me privately, I can give you my link. I am still writing fan fiction. I find that when I write regular fiction, it's my job, it's work, because I want to be a writer. Fan fiction is easier overall, but it's also and it's more relaxing and more fun for me because it's not my job. It's something that it's like dessert, right? You know, you work hard, you build the world, whatever. Fan fiction, you get to kind of take a more easy path to do that. But also when I'm feeling writer's blocked or uninspired on my regular fiction, turning around and writing some fan fiction often gets my creative juices flowing again, and sometimes gives me ideas that I end up being able to use for original stories. I'm not talking about writing a story and then what they call filing the serial numbers off, where you write a fan fiction about specific characters and then change the names. People have done that. I have never done that. That's not how I think. For me, fan fiction is fan fiction and original fiction is original fiction. And for me if I'm writing fan fiction, I'm writing fan fiction. I'm not going to pretend it's not fan fiction. I don't think there's anything wrong with that if you can make it work, but I really can't, because to me, the characters are too recognizably themselves to be for me to easily pretend that they're somebody else. But yeah, I like writing fan fiction as a way of continuing to write, even when I'm feeling writer's blocked or feeling when I'm not working on anything immediately because I've just finished one thing and I haven't yet started the next or figured out what I'm going to do next. Fan fiction keeps me writing, and it keeps the creative juices flowing. So I'll probably always write fan fiction as well as original fiction. The next book, as I said, it'll be, I don't know what the title is yet, but it'll be a variation of Snow White, a long novel, like a full-length novel, like The Eighth Key, but centering on a female-female romance. But that will come out under the name Laura Weir. I'm not sure the next thing I'm going to do as Janice L. Newman yet. That will be my next book probably, because Laura Weir's, I'm going to alternate with them, hopefully, if inspiration allows. But I'm still playing with ideas. I've got a list of ideas that I need to kind of go through and see if any of them continue to spark interest, or I may come across something else that sparks my ideas and go with that. I'm taking the next couple weeks off starting Saturday, and then come the new year, I'm going to start writing again every weekday because it's my job.
Personally, I'd love to see some more of Jay. Just throwing it out there.
Ooh.
Thank you so much, Janice, for the wonderful interview and for sharing an excerpt from the book. For those who haven't read At First Contact, it is a wonderful collection of genre romance novellas, and you can get that at Space Cowboy or directly from Journey Press. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for the audience question there. Janice L. Newman, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you too. Thank you so much for having me. This was just a lot of fun.